everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show we have Rick Tarnas and Sean Kelly here to talk about a new book, Psyche Unbound, subtitle Essays in Honor of Stanislav Grof. Really thankful you two put in all this effort, and welcome to the show. Excited to have you both on for the first time.
Thanks, Joe. It's nice to be
Joe.
here.
Yes, likewise.
Yeah, I'm excited. Rick, I think you're... the most enormous book I've ever purchased in my life was yours. And I think it took me about 3 years to read it in my undergrad. But I got through it, and I'm really thankful. Can you guess which one?
It would have been Passion of the Western Mind if it was useful for your undergraduate work.
Certainly not useful in my undergrad. No, it's your great astrology book. And I'm
Cosmos and Psyche.
Yeah, it's been right behind me for years, but I spaced on the name for a moment there.
Yeah, that's a slightly longer book, and yes, some very advanced university students might find that helpful in their pursuits.
Yeah, it was great. And Sean, I'm really thankful to get to meet you here. I fortunately and unfortunately don't know a ton about you, but I'm really excited to get to know you here and dig into your work and what you guys did with this book. So everybody that's a listener knows that I'm a massive fan of Stan Grof. I was somewhat obsessed for decades, but I'll try to manage. And we've got this great new book, forward by Rick Doblin. And I'm kind of curious, like what was the initial impulse for this book? Was there something that happened other than him getting pretty old, or was it just time?
I actually was thinking of the book before he got old, relatively speaking, because, he and I started working together almost 50 years ago, back in the 1970s at Esalen Institute. And even then, even before his first book came out, Joseph Campbell had written about Stan's work, and that essay combined with when Huston Smith came out in about 1975 with an essay on what he regarded as the singular importance of Stan's research and findings and theories. Two different kind of world scholars, one in the area of understanding world mythologies and depth psychology, and that's Joe Campbell, and then Huston in the area of the world's religions and mystical traditions. And then it was just one after another. Fritjof Capra came out with a chapter on Stan and the importance that he saw of Stan's work relative to understanding the shifts in modern physics, quantum physics, and relativity theory. So it was pretty early that I started thinking it would be nice to collect all these excellent essays. And then as we got into the 80s and 90s, and there was more and more essays being produced by different scholars, and we were starting. Stan at this point was in his 60s, so I thought, why don't we put a fest trip together for his 70th birthday? And then actually the book that you just referred to, Cosmos and Psyche, the contract for that came in from the New York publisher saying, if you can just stop everything else, including teaching, we'll pay for you to just focus on this book for the next 2 years. And so I did. And Stan had been wanting that book to be published, so he said, just put the fest trip off until later. But unfortunately, life, as happens, delayed it further. But there was a great consequence to delaying it past, that was back in about 2000, and that is that, it was 2001, and that is that in the last several years, the kind of renaissance of psychedelic research has taken place, and the legalization of psychedelic research again. And the fact that new research was now happening in which we could include essays by current researchers such as Charles Grove and Michael Mithoefer and so forth. And the fact We are now approaching Stan's 90th birthday. All these things permitted the possibility of bringing together a wide collection of really extraordinary essays, all of which are in some way either elaborating Stan's work, opening up new theoretical perspectives, comparative studies with other traditions, as well as quite remarkable original work within the same fields that Stan has kind of opened up for the scholarly and therapeutic communities. So by also the great fortune of having Stan still with us now and able to appreciate, despite the fact that he's 90 years old, it was just fantastic that we were able to pull this all together. And Sean Kelly here with us, Sean played such a crucial role in these last few years, joining me as co-editor, and really helped make it possible, including the title of this book, which I think is quite a perfect title for the book. That was Sean's proposal, and there's just something about co-editing a big work like this that is a lot easier, was a lot more reasonable a task, and I'm so grateful for him. So that was a bit of a background on what went into this, but Sean, I'd love to hear your assessment as well.
Gee, well, I grew up in Canada, and before moving to the Bay Area in 1997, I had been teaching at Canadian universities in religious studies departments, and my field was the psychology of religion, and with a focus initially on Jung, but also transpersonal psychology. So I knew of Stan's work while still in Canada before coming here, was very impressed by it. But I didn't know Stan personally. Well, I met him actually when I was still in Canada for the first time in around 1990, 1991 for a breathwork workshop in Detroit. And actually is when I spoke to Stan at that event and told him about a book that I was incubating on sort of the deep structure and history of transpersonal psychology. He said, "Oh, you should talk to my friend and colleague Richard Tarnas," because he recognized that our we were thinking in similar ways. And I just made a little note. I think I may have written down Rick's name, but I didn't know who he was. It was really, excuse me, about a year later where I picked up another book, Rick's first book, Passion of the Western Mind, while still in Canada, and recognized, oh my God, this man is thinking my thoughts. And I looked in the index and checked for Jung. Jung was there. My philosopher Hegel was there. And I said, just for a lark, I'm going to check for Grof. And gee, Grof is in there too. So anyway, through a series of synchronicities, starting with going to the first time Stan had been back in Prague for the ITA conference in Prague in 1992, I went there because I knew Stan would be there and I knew Rick would be there, and I got to meet him. It's a long story, but just to say that through picking up that book, through the calling of the stars and karma, I got linked with Rick and Stan, and Rick ended up inviting me to come and teach here. And at that point, what had been important for me theoretically in my teaching suddenly became my lived world. And, Rick became one of my closest friends and mentors and, karmic guides. And I got to know Stan. So, I've just been so grateful all these years to have been swept up into this deep, meaningful, current of ideas and research and friendships. So when Rick asked me to, co-edit the volume, of course, I leapt at the opportunity. It's such a great honor. I could say more, but that's how I got involved with this project.
Great. And yes, this does seem like a good follow-up from the Festschrift, which is an amazing event. Plenty of it's on YouTube for those of you who don't know what that is. It was a great ceremony in honoring of Stan.
Right. It was the Festschrift is the book, actually, the festival of writings, and then what we had on Saturday, that the City Lights bookstore, the very storied City Lights bookstore from North Beach of San Francisco, played such a role in the counterculture over the last 60 plus years. It hosted this all-day event, and it's going to be posted on YouTube, I think, within the week. But there was several hundred people in attendance at the time. But all these excellent speakers, including some of the contributors to the book, to Psyche Unbound, as well as others, were on a series of 3 panels, very, very fine discussions, and I think it was quite meaningful for many people who attended it. And Stan himself was a participant on the first panel, and it was great to have him chime in.
Beautiful. Yeah, I heard all about this event. I actually considered coming. Was it in person at City Lights?
No, it was all, as almost everything is right now in the particularly anyway in the Bay Area, but I imagine through much of the U.S. in these kinds of bookish events or academic things are very much that is, at least graduate school types of things. If you can be online, it's online right now until the coast is a little clearer.
Mm-hmm. Great, that's excellent. Now, how I imagine, Rick, it wasn't very hard for you to get Rick Doblin to help write the foreword, since you've been around for a while in similar circles.
I think I think it was actually his initiative, so it wasn't hard at all. What was my initiative in inviting him in was because MAPS, Rick Doblin, probably most of your audience will know, is the founder of Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which has played such a terrific role, very effective role in bringing about the sea change in the world of psychedelic medicine and research, psychotherapy. And his organization had published a couple of Stan's earlier books, and in particular this most recent, the final book that kind of double volume encyclopedia that Stan published, called The Way of the Psychonaut. And they'd done a good job with it, and as Sean and I were getting to the point where we had all the essays pretty clearly in place, and we're beginning the final editing. Over the years, I had always planned on publishing this with one of the university presses, particularly SUNY, State University of New York Press, which has published a number of Stan's works as well as other transpersonal works in that field. And but given the fact that Stan's 90th birthday was coming up very soon, just this last July, and the fact that I knew that MAPS, if they published it, would move it right to the head of the line and would devote, kind of dedicated resources to the task, but also the fact that it has connections to the market that would be especially, that is the audience out there that would be especially interested in reading essays that involve this kind of interface between psychedelic therapy, the history of psychedelic explorations and research, and multiple different fields of the kind of bridge between psychedelics and mysticism, or between psychedelics and social justice, or between psychedelic experience and Hindu symbolism in the Upanishads or the Gita. So it was just a great opportunity to. I just thought, well, I know Rick. I'll just give him a ring and see what he thinks about this idea. And he said, yes, let's do it. And then the final step was that at that point, MAPS realized that it could do an even better job if it connected with an established publisher that also specializes in this area, and that is Synergetic Press. And so from that point on, it was Synergetic Press and their editors working with Sean and myself. And then Rick came in to offer a very fine forward, and then Sean and I wrote the introduction that kind of gives a brief biography of Stan's work and its legacy, its importance for really human welfare, and perhaps the welfare of the earth. Not putting too big a thing on it, but God knows the collective psyche of humanity needs to go through a profound transformation for us to have a viable relationship to the Earth community.
Well put. And I note, and I think you mentioned this earlier, you've got the Joseph Campbell essay, No More Horizons, then right followed up by Huston Smith. Incredible way to start a book. I actually don't know Francis Vaughan, but these were kind of early pre-existing essays that you collected.
That's right. In fact, they're no longer with us. Although at the time, for example, with Huston, people like Joseph Campbell, Huston Smith, Francis Vaughan, Fritjof, Capra, they all would come to. Also, Ralph Metzner is one of those, also no longer with us, who also contributed a fine essay. And all of these were people who came to Esalen Institute, where I lived and worked for 10 years and was the director of programs there. And Stan Grof was the scholar in residence for all those years, and even stayed longer while I then went to write Passion of the Western Mind. And so these were people who we knew as they would be invited in to teach seminars and would come to the big month-long gatherings that Stan would create, kind of conference workshop seminars where he would gather really significant thinkers like David Bohm, for example, or it could be a shaman or a spiritual leader like Lama Govinda and so forth. But Francis Vaughan, Ralph Metzner, Joe Campbell, Huston Smith, they would come to Esalen, and so these were all part of the kind of community of scholars that were interested in these areas. And so but you should also know that in the case of Joseph Campbell, he read an early paper or manuscript of Stan's 5 years before the first book by Stan was published, Realms of the Human Unconscious. And it was reading that in manuscript form and then writing this nearly ecstatic letter to Dr. Grof, which we actually reproduced the original letter in handwritten. That is Joseph Campbell's own handwriting on, I think it's Sarah Lawrence College stationery.
That's funny.
And we reproduced it there at the end of his first essay there. So yeah, he was an early recognizer even before the work was more publicly known, and Huston as well. then gradually more and more people, as Stan's books became published, like yourself or Sean, were exposed to Stan's ideas, and a number of those, the later essays, come from people who are not only still with us, but also still very much on the creative edge right now in terms of their work.
So maybe this is a good time, Chris, Sean, maybe from your kind of religious scholarship, philosophy background, like why is Stan so important? I love asking people this because you get kind of a few different categories of answers.
Yeah, well, I mean, I could say something about why. I mean, I can't separate my own personal experience. As an early adolescent, when I was 13, actually, I underwent my psychedelic initiation. But
a late starter there.
Yeah, I was in 1973, but I didn't know it was initiation.
13 years old.
Wow. Yeah, but the thing is, I didn't even know the word initiation at the time, and of course I didn't know what an initiation was, and I had no elders and no sitters. I didn't know about set and setting, intention, no support, nothing like that. Nevertheless, it completely catalyzed my my life in many ways, and opened up my doors of perception and introduced me to heavens and hells and so on. But I stopped experimenting with psychedelics when I was 18, after a couple of really, really difficult sessions where, I just thought I can never do this again. And for those as well, I had no container, nobody to help me, no elder. I was just riding the last wave of the counterculture as it lapped on the shores of Ottawa, Canada, and I was interested in expanding consciousness. That was the only word I had at the time. We were interested in expanding consciousness. It was only after that, after I stopped experimenting on my own, that I found my calling after going to university and became, I realized what I wanted to be was a scholar. And I specialized in religious studies and eventually Jungian psychology and transpersonal psychology, and discovered Grof's work finally. So I was drawn to Jung also because Jung psychology recognizes the reality of spirit, recognizes the sacred character of the world, and offers the possibility, at least, for the individual to cultivate a direct relationship to the sacred or the divine. Now, through Jung, I only could do that intellectually. So I had my earlier experience with no context. Then I went to Jung, which gave me an intellectual route. And I did my dream work and so on, and Jungian analysis, which was great. But then when I discovered Stan's work, which came out of, suddenly I said, oh, now I'm starting to see what happened. And I didn't have this context, but now I have this context. So that enabled me to start linking my professional academic calling as a scholar of religious studies, comparative religion, transpersonal psychology, with my earlier incomplete initiation. So this is why it was so important for me, personally. And having done that, I started writing I started trying to introduce Stan's work to the rather conservative religious studies community in Canada. And all of my students loved it, but the older faculty were not impressed, sort of thing. I think it's changing now, but I'm sure I didn't get this job, for instance, even though I was the only one of two people at one point, because the one who did get it, an old friend of mine, gave his lecture on Freud and Freud's psychology of religion. I gave mine on Grof. Anyway, Stan's work, there's two things. He gives a model that is just so vast, comprehensive, and generative that allows one, much as Jung's does, but in different ways, allows one to navigate across the terrain of religious experience, and so-called non-ordinary states of consciousness, or holotropic states of consciousness, but religious myths and rituals and mystical experiences and so on. So Stan's work is invaluable to the psychology of religion from a theoretical point of view, from a phenomenological point of view. But also, as you know, he, with his whole therapeutic approach, holotropic therapy, psychedelic therapy, gives indications of how one can actually experience these realms and not only read about them. I mean, people will experience them spontaneously, of course, or through their own contemplative practices. There are many means. But so this is I think, why Stan's work is so important from a religious studies and transpersonal psychology point of view. I'll just say one last thing, and that is that, as I tried to show in a chapter of my most recent book that just came out, Stan's perinatal theory in particular.
That book is called Coming Home, by the way.
Oh, sorry, that one, or Becoming Gaia, the most recent one.
Oh, the most recent one. Oh,
yeah. So chapter 5 of Becoming Gaia, where I actually take up a theme that Rick had introduced me to and has been working on for decades. The idea that the Earth community is undergoing a kind of planetary initiation. So the theme of initiation once again, and we're being drawn into a collective near-death experience with runaway climate change, mass extinction, and so on. So in this chapter, I show how Stan's perinatal model can really help us understand the dynamics of the initiation that the Earth community is going through right now, even to the details of gaining some insight, for instance, in the tensions in the activist communities around climate change, where some are warning that it's too late. Others are saying, no, we need to have hope, and so on. Stan's model can really help us understand what's going on at that level. So I'll just end there.
Love it.
Yeah, if I could maybe piggyback on a couple of things that you said there, Sean. I think you're putting your finger on a number of important things, but one, that the fact that Stan, working within, to begin with, basically the psychoanalytic tradition coming out of Freud, but because of the power of the medicine, in the earlier years it was LSD, and in subsequent years bringing in a range of different psychedelics, including psilocybin, mescaline, and ibogaine, and ketamine, etc. But then also, just the power of the medicine permitted a direct experience that people had that began typically, especially when they were using lower doses, began within a psychological realm that was in some ways very much relevant to the psychoanalytic tradition that Freud and the other major psychoanalysts, like people like Abraham and Melanie Klein and so forth had set out. But then as people kept having deeper experiences as time went on, then these opened up to very powerful kind of existential engagements with the experience of death, and also reliving such early biographical experiences that it went right back to birth itself, and prenatal experience as well as perinatal experience. And at that level, something else happened, which is that these experiences started to become not only personal individual biography, and not only related to biological and kind of individual psychology as would be understood by a relatively materialistic psychoanalytic viewpoint, it started opening up to experiences that were collective experiences, historical experiences, karmic, archetypal, mythological, mystical, experiencing different types of animal consciousness or identification with the whole earth, or cosmic consciousness of different types. And what was remarkable is that engaging a healing modality opened up to a level of experience in which the numinous became itself a source of healing, as well as a transformer of worldviews. I mean, people shifted what they regarded as being most important and also most real. And there's something about people having near-death experiences in other contexts that often bring up illuminations of other dimensions, other realities, or also reconfiguring one's own moral values in a way that you see, oh, now that I know a little bit more like what our mortal life is, I suddenly realize how I want to live the rest of my life in a very different way than I had been living. So I think what Stan's approach permitted was the possibility of linking our own kind of individual journey and our own individual healing process with of a more kind of classic psychological quality, like recovering traumas and working them through and integrating past memories and so forth, but that this became intricately and intimately linked with mystical experiences that could embrace all of reality, and also that could open one up to a totally different relationship to how one relates to other people, how one relates to the rest of the of nature, the rest of the Earth community, the rest of the cosmos. So, and also how you relate to other cultures too. Suddenly realizing that other cultures are carrying wisdom, traditions, and levels of insight that modernity had obscured from its vision. So, I think Stan served as a great bridge figure from between kind of a more classic, modern, Western, scientific, psychoanalytic frame of reference to the whole range of mystical and spiritual and indigenous and traditions, as well as other dimensions of reality that were simply outside of the radar screen of the conventional modern worldview.
I love that. We were just chatting a little bit about Joe Campbell, Huston Smith. From what we know, Joseph Campbell never really had an encounter with psychedelics, and probably also not Holzberg breathwork. But we do know that Huston Smith did, and I find that pretty interesting. I actually think I did read some of that material. It's kind of interesting, him reflecting on it. But anything you want to share about a Huston Smith coming back and discussing the importance of the psychedelic experience?
Huston was pretty early on the game there, because he was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, teaching at MIT. Knew Aldous Huxley, and then later Tim Leary and Alpert, who were over at Harvard, but it's all in Cambridge. And he was part of the Good Friday experiment in 1962. So he had some very important transformational experiences, and he had made his reputation, of course, with his work on the world's religions, going back to the 1950s and 60s, and he really was a deep student of various mystical traditions and their what's called perennial philosophy and the kind of common mystical core that he saw within the many spiritual traditions, religious traditions. And for him, the psychedelic experience was like this unexpected opportunity to experience directly things that he often had just been reading about. I mean, he certainly had intimations of what the mystical experience was about, but it was on an entirely new and more vivid experiential level that that his psychedelic sessions opened up an encounter with the spiritual and mystical dimensions. And so for him, I think kind of in continuity with Aldous Huxley, for him, psychedelics served as a kind of really like an opportunity for the modern human being to connect with mystical truths that otherwise might seem more abstract or out of reach, and that it could put you in touch with them. It didn't necessarily keep you in touch with them, and he recognized that one had to integrate them into one's life, but he felt it was very special in that way. However, I also know that when he had difficult experiences, psychedelic experiences, his approach was, and I don't know if this was his original phrase or whether he was quoting somebody else like Alan Watts or somebody, but it was something along the line of, with psychedelic experiences, when you got the message, hang up the phone. After you've gotten the message, hang up the phone. And I think that was a reflection of, after a few sessions of having, vivid spiritual openings and kind of epiphanies as to the nature of things, and that being so valuable for him, and in some ways affirming his life philosophy and his scholarly research and so forth. But after that, to get into more difficult materials, psychological, difficult experientially, it seemed like, it's time to hang up the phone. And this is where Stan offers a different approach, because what he found was that it was often the challenging experiences, the really difficult ones, the ones where one is encountering not only problematic or traumatic, psychological issues, complexes, traumas from early life, etc. It was bringing these up from the deep unconscious, where they're lodged in our body and in our psyche, and bringing them to consciousness and working them through, releasing the emotions and the physical responses that have been kind of bottled up in the psychophysical organism for decades, and that was the very means by which a psychospiritual transformation could open up, and that one could thereby have both a healing experience and a deeper mystical experience of life. That it's not that one should avoid positive ones; those are gifts. Those open things up out of the grace of life, to one. But the difficult experiences, he learned to trust that process. That there's like an inner healer in every person, and that each person has their own journey that can involve dark nights of the soul. It can involve experiences that are so terrifying that you can be quite sure that you're going insane and that you'll never come out of it, or that you're dying, quite literally, not just in some metaphorical way. And this is why he put such an emphasis on how important it is to have a safe set and setting, a guide, an elder, a shaman, a trained psychedelic therapist, because you never should underestimate the power of psychedelics to put one through an experience that can blow your mind, not just in the wonderful sense, but also in the sense of completely destabilizing your sense of kind of egoic security and so forth, and reality testing. You really want to have a secure context so that you can trust what's happening and go with it. And this is one of the key points that Stan has conveyed over the decades, and why I think Stan's work served as such a thread connecting the earlier kind of birth of psychedelic initiation within the modern context. Obviously, it's been going on for millennia with the many indigenous societies that have continued to use these powerful sacred medicines. But within the modern Western kind of Eurocentric context, this was a huge initiation. And Stan's work has served as a kind of bridge from the 50s and 60s up until now for thousands of people who used his works as kind of guides for how to engage the psychonaut's journey, how to engage these deep explorations of the psyche, and something as crucial as how to deal with a session in which, within a few minutes of having taken the 500 micrograms of LSD, one is deeply regretting the fact that you've probably made the biggest mistake of your life, and it's a totally convincing place, and that you're getting into a hell that you'll never get out of. And Stan's message that basically, as he put it, the full experience of that state of hell in this case is the funeral pyre of that emotion. And it's only by bringing it up to consciousness and, in some sense, surrendering to it, allowing it to kind of fully express itself in your awareness and in your body, that it can be released, and so that healing and integration can happen. And so that's a different attitude than get the message, hang up the phone. He says, I think Stan's attitude is stay on the phone, trust something's happening here. You may not know what it is, Mr. Jones, but something is happening here that is profound. And go with it. There's an inner healer at work here that is working in mysterious ways. And I think Stan's conveying of that trust in the deep psyche and its sort of self-healing capacities, and trust in the mystery of this whole process, rather than having a theory that completely nails things down and a technique that you use no matter what. Instead, having this more open, trusting, processive attitude, I think has been a tremendous gift in allowing many other people to trust and have courage in these explorations.
I love that. As you were speaking, I'm reminded of Chris Baish's book, somebody who really trusted the process. I thought it was quite ambitious of him, the way he proceeded. But
well, he totally got it from Stan, as he's the first to say. I mean, he was there in Ohio and read Stan's work and just was. Of course, he had to find that trust within himself, but to do that kind of deep inner diving that he did and journeying. But I do know, known Chris for many years, and Stan was the person who both alerted him to the potential, but also served as a kind of, through his writings for many years, because he hadn't met Stan yet, it was through his writings that Chris received a kind of structure and orientation that allowed him to trust this process and go with it, even when it was quite discouraging at times.
Right. Yeah. Um, yeah, I think the hang up the phone thing, the way we teach about it here is there's an obvious sense of overuse that can happen, or literal overuse, not a sense of. And yeah, we just got to watch it. But it's okay to come back, but we've got to do it properly and safely and intelligently, especially when we're doing these big internal trips. I really appreciate what did you say there about the difficult experiences. Yes, it's like a balance. Too far in one direction, there's going to be some wacky stuff that comes up. So you kind of have to take the good with the bad. And yeah, you were describing my first ever ayahuasca come up quite accurately. Never coming back. Like I'm ruined. All this stuff. Intellectually, beforehand, I knew I was totally safe, and everything was going to be fine. It's quite interesting how that can happen. Yeah. So,
I think what you brought up about the needing the balance. I think the psyche has a well, this is something that Jung taught, as Sean could articulate as well. Namely, how if you are too far in one direction, there's a compensatory impulse at work in the psyche that will bring things into balance, often against one's conscious will. And you'll draw experiences towards you. You'll draw people and events towards you out of the blue that will kind of bring one down to size if one's gotten inflated. And the fact of the matter is, psychedelic experience does have that potential for almost like titanic inflation, tremendous hubris, like the feeling that, oh, wow, I am the most brilliant person that's ever lived. I'm seeing things that nobody has ever seen. I'm at the absolute forefront of human evolution. And that kind of hubris and psychological and spiritual inflation is like a recipe for ego death waiting around the corner in all sorts of ways, and it has a kind of inevitability. So the beauty of this approach that Stan has taught is like, he'll notice when somebody's getting into that inflated place, and encourage them to go back inside, put the eye shades on again. Don't follow your impulse right now to call the White House and let them know that the world is going to be saved by your person and your insight, but rather this is a suggestion. Stan would say what you're getting right now, and that those feelings suggest that there's something more still to be worked through, and that you're compensating for it by kind of whistling in the dark and magnifying the positive, because you sense that you've got some further dying to do that you really don't want to do, and so you're more manically motivated to get out in the world and deliver your messianic message.
You mentioned ego death there, Rick, and Sean. I'm kind of curious if you could comment on this kind of concept of ego death. I find it troubling phrase, but a helpful concept sometimes. So once I heard Stan talk about it being kind of like it's not exactly your ego's dying. It's more of like you realize your persona is just that, a persona, more so than, because you're always still there, you. But I don't know. Could you riff on that briefly for me?
Yeah. Well, we like to think that we are each a sort of monolithic, stable, unambiguous identity that we usually identify with a name and a certain history and so on. But we know that that's not true. From the 19th century through Freud and Jung, we realize that the psyche is actually a multiplicity of relatively autonomous identities, which Stan calls systems of condensed experience, which Jung called complexes, which the ancients used to call just spirits. basically, that we are always in relationship to a multiplicity of beings and spirits.
And gods and goddesses.
And gods and goddesses, yeah. And so, quite naturally within whatever society we're in, given our own individual history and the society that we grow up in, we adapt to identify our sense of self with a particular configuration of images and values and stories and so on. And to the extent that this identity that we can call the ego is either dysfunctional or suboptimal in terms of being a conduit for the full potential of who you really are, we will get sick. There'll be suffering of one kind or another, some form of pathology, whether it's anxiety, depression, projection, physical illness, acting out, all of these things, right? So the idea is that that configuration of identity that we normally call the ego, to the extent that it is either suboptimal or actually the main conduit for pathology, it needs to go under. It needs to be deconstructed to allow for a reconfiguration of the psyche that will be less prone to suffering and might be more creative and generative. But the question is what's the best way to do that? Rick was just saying that it often happens naturally through a compensation, whether an illness or synchronistically, as Jung said, things will just happen to us to force a reconfiguration of who we think we are. And but if we want to try to enter into that intentionally through a psychedelic session or through other forms of deep experiential work, if we're intentionally putting ourselves in a situation where that habitual center of identity is going to be deconstructed, then as Stan emphasizes, it's essential to do that within a context that has a higher level of integrity and compassion and self-reflection than is our normal state of being in the world. Because when that structure disintegrates, we're left with the multiplicity that is always there. And if part of that field is full of traumatic, dissociated parts of ourselves, once the session is over, there's no guarantee that anything better than was there before will resurface. The old habits, the old defenses will just reconfigure, or there might even be renewed defenses and dissociations from those more traumatic elements that were activated. So I just want to stress the importance of a sitter, of a guide. I personally think a compassionate sitter is more important than any shaman or guru or just somebody who can just be there for you, hold your hand even, and
who has some experience in this area.
Ideally, some experience. But I mean, in my case, for example, when I was 13, my second experience, I had window pain, a high dose of window pain acid, and I was just like completely. I couldn't speak. But I grabbed this girl in the hallway, and I was in a French school, but I spoke to her in English because I couldn't speak French anymore. And I told her I needed some help. She brought me outside and sat beside me as I lay in the snow for about 3 hours, and was just with me. And that transformed what had been a kind of hell state, where I was trapped in this world of mirrors, a no exit situation, into one of just floating on this sea of a kind of nourishing milk white snow ocean. But it wouldn't have happened unless this compassionate being was willing just to sit with me and hold my hand. So
you had an angel looking over you there. That's a beautiful story. if I can add a little bit about the complex issue about ego death. I mean, it's a very good point because in some ways, a lot of psychotherapy is trying to strengthen a fragile ego. It's trying to help a person who's been traumatized, who has not been given sufficient, emotional nourishment or grounding or mirroring or whatever would have been missing in early childhood, etc., and is trying to forge a more viable sense of identity and ability to navigate in life, and also to be able to hold values that you orient your life according to without undue anxiety or over dependence on others' approval, things like that. All those things are important, and it could seem as if the call for ego death is, in that sense, almost a contrary attitude towards traditional psychotherapy. And the outcome of the kind of experience, this death rebirth experience that Stan discusses, and the perinatal stages, BPMs, the basic perinatal matrices, and then towards the end of this reliving of birth that's interconnected with the encounter with one's own mortality in all sorts of ways, and with a kind of existential desolation. That the outcome of this is a sense of being reborn with a very strong sense of identity. But now that identity is in some sense strong because it's grounded in the whole. It's grounded in the earth. It's connected to the whole evolutionary process and spiritual matrix that has brought one forth. And so, in that respect, there is still a kind of egoic, like the executive functions are in some sense much more, could be much more efficient and much more robust and skillful after this ego death experience than before. But at the same time, it's not just a simple, I'm just going to get past, I just want to transcend my sense of being a separate entity, and I want to get beyond my public persona, and I want to now have a more enlightened attitude. It seems to be part of this type of perinatal death rebirth initiatory experience that there is typically, not always, but typically, a real dark night of the soul that it also can include a sense of really having to face one's shadow, go through tremendous experiences of guilt, of hopelessness, of shame about past, or a sense of a total being immersed in a totally negative view of life, that life is just all destined to die, that there's no real meaning in life. Mm-hmm. And this can be a completely convincing gestalt that one enters into in these experiences. And that gestalt seems to almost be a kind of threshold of initiation. It seems to be a kind of one in some ways has to surrender to it in order to get through it. The way, as we've heard many times, the way out is the way through. And this is almost like a central message of Stan's psychotherapeutic strategy. So I just want to emphasize that the issue of what's dying exactly is a complicated one, and the result is not is often a person who's more engaged effectively in the world and seeing the world with greater kind of clarity, efficacy, interpersonal sensitivity, awareness of the larger environment, and so forth, with much more clarity. In all these ways, it can be very similar to a more conventional psychological consequence, but it's grounded in such a deeper spiritual whole that and it did involve a greater price, typically a larger price of encounter with the most agonizing aspects of existence, and identifying with those who have suffered. Of all sorts of, whether it's oppressed populations or being able to learn experientially what it is like to experience, just all sorts of life's and death's most challenging kinds of experiences.
Mm. This reminds me, I was at a conference in Miami, Wonderland, and the Compass Pathways clinical trial results came out, and it bummed everybody out. And one of the biggest things in there, it's great study, productive for what it's worth from Compass, but there was an increase in suicidal ideation, and I believe that comes hand in hand with this dark night of the soul, and suggesting that we're going to get clinical results without, things going downhill temporarily for somebody. It's kind of, I don't know, it's a little iffy. Like, this path, like, you have to have those drops before you're healed. I don't have to, maybe that's a little bit too prescriptive or universalizing, but I don't know.
Yeah, some people have had the really difficult and downer experiences in their everyday life for a long time and a very discouraging worldview, and then they have a psychedelic session, and it just opens them up to a whole different, a trust in life, a trust in their, they may be a dying cancer patient, and the psychedelic experience provides only a positive, but it's a positive that's coming within a context of having, gone through a lot of suffering already. So again, Stan's attitude has been one of trusting whatever is coming up, that there's, whether it's a difficult experience or a positive one. The positive ones can often serve as a kind of grounding and an awareness that you can keep in the back of your mind, that this is on the other, when a difficult experience starts coming up, that this higher unity is still waiting for you in some ways, or you can trust that the hard experience is not the only game in town. But if the hard one comes up, and it may come up first, then that's where it's, I think, very important to have some preparation with set and setting, and a recognition to trust this, and that it's a process and it's not a one-stop show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so much more I want to get into right now, so we're going to have you back on, but I'm just kind of curious. This Stan at one point was speaking to one of my friends and said something along the lines of he's kind of disappointed in where we're at in this psychedelic, I guess we'll call it a culture, not exactly a community. So, like, for instance, he did so much research. A lot of people were doing so much research at the beginning of this whole project, and all of it seems to have been thrown out the window. Modern science doesn't really seem to know what to do with it, because it wasn't as controlled as they would have preferred. Kind of curious to hear from both of you on this. Obviously we need caution. We need really helpful science to help steer us in a good direction here. But do you have any kind of reactions around this whole topic of let's do it all over again, but better and more expensive this time? And then maybe we can help people clinically, because it seems like the three of us here are pretty convinced, but maybe we want to be a little cautious. But
Sean, do you want to take a crack at it, and then I can?
Well, given the current standards for what counts as valid research, particularly since therapy is so tied in now to the health industry, and it is an industry with insurance and so on, there are inevitably going to be these constraints. So hopefully, as more and more studies do get done, and as these first MAP studies, if they continue to be as positive as these first MAP studies with psilocybin and MDMA, for instance, then hopefully that will have the effect of encouraging a more sympathetic attitude to earlier qualitative research, which is more case study based and less quantitative with double blind and parameters and so on. So I think it's just where we are now, and I imagine if it continues along positive lines, I think it'll change the attitude to the earlier research. What about you, Rick?
Yeah, I think that's well put. And there is a tendency, the academic world and the medical establishment are, to a great extent, for worse as well as for better, tied to a quantitative scientific approach to research. And that can underestimate the value of the kind of research that was done in the early years, as you're mentioning, including Stan's, which in a way is more in the tradition of Jung and Freud, and kind of very in-depth studies experientially, phenomenologically, and putting the focus just on a quantitative, like testing afterwards, how does one answer certain questionnaires and things like that, can kind of filter out a lot of the most important information that one could be receiving from these experiences. So I think when Stan has mentioned being disappointed at times with the current, say, some of the psychedelic medical research being done or being proposed, in terms of protocols going to the FDA and so forth, that he feels that the whole spiritual dimension is just being kind of eclipsed. It's just being left out, and that turns out to be such an important dimension of the experience and of the healing that he's wondering, is there going to be an adequate recognition of that fundamental heart of the psychedelic experience? I think, the cat's out of the bag. It has been out of the bag for several decades. A lot of people now recognize that this is an extraordinarily important gift that the earth has given us, of whether sacred vision plants or the synthesized forms such as LSD or MDMA, that these really have tremendous spiritual value for us. And I think a good part of humanity and even the intelligentsia has a recognition that division that happens in the universities between the sciences and the humanities, with a more reductionistic quantitative approach in the sciences, that if that is used to colonize the way the humanities work, that is our inward understanding of inward experience, our exploration through the arts and literature, and through depth psychology, through philosophy and history and so forth, that if the humanities are colonized entirely by the methodological imperatives and constraints of the natural sciences, we're essentially blocking out much of what it is to be a human being, and blocking out many of the most essential parts of our human sentience and human faculties. And to engage life, we need all our faculties. We need a very broad epistemology that draws on the our emotions, the imagination, the body, our own subjective responses to things, our spiritual and mystical experiences. These are data to pay attention to. And this is William James's great contribution, to just recognize radical empiricism involves taking seriously all the data that human beings encounter, and not just a certain narrow range. And so I guess I trust that there is a resilience within the whole human being that will counter tendencies, as valuable as they are to have quantitative research. I don't want, I mean, when I'm deciding whether to take a vaccine or not, I'm paying attention to that quantitative research and lining up. But when it comes to assessing the ultimate nature of reality, or the ways in which a human being can be profoundly healed in their life's journey, then I want to see a larger empirical database that includes qualitative as well as quantitative experience.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
I would love a Hegelian response to that, but I'm going to let it go, Sean. Maybe next time.
Sure.
Yeah. And so I think we're at time, guys. This has been super fun. How can people find this book, Psyche Unbound?
I think it's, I know they are selling it at bookstores already, like the City Lights bookstore. And I'm sure if you just go online, Synergetic Press is the publisher. Certainly the mega corporations like Amazon are carrying it. And
your local bookstore will certainly order it in for you.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful book to, in a way, order in through your local bookstore, because one, it's physically a lovely book. Just the
that painting on the cover is unbelievable.
Yeah,
that's Stan's painting, by the way, of the his beautiful painting of the phoenix rising, and he. So anyway, it's a to do it as through your local bookstore, in a sense, is like the ideal, because they may not have seen the book already. It just came out, and that would be great for them to have it on their bookshelves besides the copy that they order for you.
Outstanding. Any plans for digital or audio editions?
Haven't gotten to that point yet. I think
I'll call Deborah and see what we can make happen over at Synergetic. Really, really exciting to have you both here, Sean and Rick. Thank you so much. Anything else you want to point out, or how about your websites, just so people can check you out on your own?
Well, I mean, I don't have a website apart from my faculty page at California Institute of Integral Studies, but so yeah, CIIS and Sean Kelly will bring you to my faculty page.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good moment to point out that Sean and myself and Stan Grof for many years, as well as Brian Swim and Charlene Spretnak and others over the years have been teaching at CIS in a program called Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness. It's a master's and Ph.D. program now available online as well. And so that's one way of exploring, because there's constantly like lectures being posted on there and wonderful, like what's called the PCC forum. PCC stands for Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness. So those who want to just kind of be exposed to the ideas and the community of scholars and seekers that are centered here in the Bay Area, but of California, but really are spread throughout the world. That's a good place to go. So CIIS, California Institute of Integral Studies, Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program. I have a website with a few essays and videos and things on it called cosmospsyche.com. Just one word, Cosmos and Psyche, all run together.com. And that's about it. You might want to see a film also those of you who are interested in Stan Grof's work, a film that just was made in the last year or so called The Way of the Psychonaut. It's also the name of his book, but this film is called The Way of the Psychonaut, and it's about Stan Grof's biography that Susan Logier made, and it's quite a lot of great material there, great footage and early photographs that many people haven't seen before, and great interviews with people. It's a great introduction to Stan's work too.
And worth noting, Stan gave a lot of feedback through the whole creation of it. So there's all sorts of tidbits in there that I had no clue about.
That's right.
Fascinating. Yeah. Well, Sean Rick, thank you so much. And I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, great meeting you, John.
Thanks.